and Ya Ali Madad. My name is Alysha Alani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series is an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on ages 18 to 40. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. In the spirit of social justice and in recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day this past Monday, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Boston, the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations. Each of us on this call today are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treatied and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like this is part of our responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands and work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and aligned with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we are continuing our series on voting and faith by exploring economic disparity. Our session will provide an opportunity for us to discuss the following: the roots and consequences of economic inequality in a deeply divided world, building a stronger and more inclusive economy with a focus on empowering the most marginalized in our society, and the faith imperative to work towards social and economic justice. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. And throughout the presentation, we welcome your questions and comments. We encourage you to participate in the poll questions that will pop up on your screen. And if you'd like to ask our panelists a question, please use the Q&A box on Zoom. We will try to address as many questions as we can. And with that, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. Sonam Bilani is the head of global partnerships at Zipline, a startup that designs drones to deliver essential medicines. Previously, she served as the senior advisor to New York City's deputy mayor and oversaw $5 billion of investments to build cutting-edge infrastructure, increase affordable housing, and promote economic development across the city. Prior to that, Sonam worked at the World Bank and helped finance and implement investments across South Asia. Sonam started her career at Goldman Sachs, where she financed over $10 billion of civic projects, including schools, hospitals, and transportation systems across the US. Sonam attended Harvard University and has a bachelor's degree in government, economics, and visual and environmental studies. She has received the President's Volunteer Service Award, leads the Coaching Fellowship to support young women in social impact careers, and volunteers with the Girl Scouts. She also founded Empower, a mentorship program for dreamers that helps immigrant and first-gen students gain admission to top-tier universities. Sonam also works within the AKDN framework to support the city's empowerment initiative. Welcome, Sonam. Thanks for joining us. Also joining us, we have Alim Remthala. Aleem is a partner at Developing World Markets, an impact investment firm that invests in microfinance institutions and small and medium enterprise lenders across 40 countries. He heads the firm's private equity practice and has been with the fund since 2008. He has over 15 years of experience with socially responsible, double and triple bottom line venture capital and private equity funds in the US and Europe. Previously, Aleem worked for Bridges Ventures in the UK and the New York City Investment Fund in the US. Both firms invested in double and triple bottom line projects, providing financial returns alongside measurable social and environmental impact, including job creation and improvement of impoverished or economically disadvantaged areas. Aleem started his career in corporate finance for JP Morgan, where he served in an advisory capacity for transportation and diversified industrial clients worldwide. Aleem received his MBA from Harvard Business School and his BA in economics and finance from Princeton University. Aleem has served as a national council member for the Aga Khan Council for USA as well as the chair for the Aga Khan Education Board USA. He currently serves on the National Committee for AKF USA and contributes to the global work of the councils in promoting sustainable livelihoods and access to finance. Welcome, Aleem, and thank you both for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. So to kick things off, can you share with our audience a little bit more about your background and work as it relates to social impact? Sonam, let's start with you.
Sure, Alysha, thanks so much for having us. And a special thanks to our audience for tuning in on this fine Sunday afternoon. I know you all probably have lots of other things going on. So we appreciate you joining us and learning more about some of these issues that are critical to our society, and especially as we get out to vote just in a few weeks. So a little bit about my background is that I was born in India and came to the US at a young age. And I grew up about 5 minutes from Chicago Jamaat Khana. Basically you could see it outside the street and walk over. And like many in our Jamaat, our family didn't have much when we came to this country, but the Ismaili community played an integral role in how I developed both personally and eventually in my professional career. The tenets of paying it forward were deeply ingrained, whether it was selling Girl Scout cookies to raise money for our troop or volunteering at the local food bank with members of our Jewish synagogue down the street. And I eventually studied government economics and urban planning at Harvard. And as my lived experience really taught me the complicated ways that a lack of adequate housing, transportation, and social services created structural barriers to upward mobility. I've dedicated my career to addressing these issues and have a range of experiences from working in investment banking at Goldman to learning, how much it actually costs to build a bridge or a school, or the numbers behind what you see and use every day. And all the way to policymaking and implementing multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, housing, and economic development projects across New York City, as well as in Asia, where many folks from our Jamaat come from. I strongly believe that government must create the infrastructure of good schools, good housing, and other services that impact our day-to-day lives, and work with the private sector to do so. And that's how we truly get at the root of economic inequality. And we'll certainly dive more into that over the next hour, but I'll pass it over to Aleem for now.
Thanks, Sonam. Excited to explore how your experiences have shaped your perspective on economic inequality. Aleem, how about you?
Great, Alysha, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Really excited to be on the panel with you and Sonam, and really excited to have this conversation. I wanted to start off by just thanking Farhana, Falak, Nadeem for allowing us the space to have this conversation. I think it's important, and I think in relation to the last several around climate change and poverty, I think it fits well in the arc, and hopefully kind of informs people's views as they head out to the polls. So before I begin, in the spirit of social justice, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from New York, the ancestral lands of the Delaware and Lenape people. My own story is somewhat similar to Sonam's, and I'd imagine much of the Jamaat as well. My family came over from Tanzania as economic migrants via France. Various family members went to Canada, to London, and we were undocumented, soon after we arrived, but we were able to get status with Reagan's kind of immigration reform bill in '86, which offered amnesty for folks that came in prior to '82. I think the Jamaat and the Jamaati institutions were always a big part of my life, growing up. We were also, similar to Sonam, minutes away from Queens Jamaat Khana, and a very active participant in YSB and Alims and Mosaics and ITREB programs and education board. At various points it felt a little dichotomous. The work I was beginning to do, post-graduation in 2001 and the work that I needed to do or wanted to do for the community. So I started my career in 2001 as the dot-com bubble burst. And my first day on the job was September 11th, 2001, which will live in infamy. So this was, to a large extent, what actually informed the trajectory of my career from that point on. I sought opportunities to find a way to balance, the need to build, security as most children of immigrants, feel, and find ways to give back in ways I knew how. I was fortunate enough to find mentors to help me kind of along that journey. I went to HBS in 2007, again, graduating into the economy, into an economy that was collapsing around me with the financial crisis in 08 and 09. I joked, because I couldn't really do anything much, but if you really wanted to find the downturn in the cycle, you would estimate when I would be graduating out of school, and generally that coincided with another crisis. But coming out of school, I had greater clarity and purpose. I wanted a job that focused on emerging and frontier markets. I wanted to find a job where I could use money to do more than just make more money. And so I found my current firm. And at the time, my business school classmates didn't really know what to do with me. Either I was a greedy capitalist or a nonprofit guy. But over time, hopefully we can get into some of that dichotomy at some point during this discussion. But that's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Aleem. Giving hope to all the 2020 graduates, I'm sure, right now. And given your depth of expertise, it's great that you can lend that global perspective to the topics we're going to discuss today. So as you know, the focus of today's conversation is economic disparity. So let's just start by defining it. What is economic disparity? What does it look like? What is the impact of it on society? Sonam, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. And Aleem, I can attest to you. I think my resume drop was the day Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, right? So here we are as seniors trying to get jobs, and the world is collapsing around us. And I think, for the younger folks in the audience, like, it all works out. And I think both of us are a testament to that. So, and again, please feel free to get in touch with any of us if we can help in any way. But back to the core issues here. So I think economic disparity, frankly, results from economic inequality, right? And that's the unequal distribution of income, wealth, and opportunity between different groups in society. And it's a concern in almost all countries around the world, and often people are trapped in poverty with little chance to climb up the social ladder. And again, many of us are fortunate that we were able to come here and as a Jamaat have been able to climb that social ladder, but we've also benefited from significant policies, whether it's immigration reform during the Reagan era or even folks like us coming into the country. And that, I think, is at the root cause. What is government doing and what is the private sector doing to ensure that folks who are at the lower end of the income spectrum can actually move up? So I'll start off with some numbers, and we apologize for being very nerdy participants in this panel, but hopefully, we want to show how this plays out and provide context and visualization so that it's easier to understand. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The wealthiest 10% of households have long controlled more than 50% of the wealth. But that proportion has grown steadily to 70% of the wealth over the past 2 decades. And half of Americans with the lowest wealth own just about 1% of the total value of assets in our country. So these are things like homes, cars, investments, retirement accounts, and much else. So you can really, really see that huge concentration of wealth in the top half of the income spectrum. And that, by definition, is an unequal society. Inequality, and inequality again exists around the world, right? And we see it every day. But the US really stands apart here, even when compared to other developed economies. Inequality has increased across the world since the 1980s, but the rate at which it has increased in the US is much greater. And one of the many reasons for this stark contrast is our progressive tax structure and changes throughout the decades. So we're actually going to switch over to a short video clip that shows that. So here you see that drastic change, right, as to what our tax structure, quote unquote, progressive tax structure used to look like in the 1950s versus what it looks like today. And 10 years ago, Warren Buffett, made this famous claim that he paid a lower tax rate than his secretary, thanks to the many loopholes and deductions that benefit the wealthy. And the effective tax rate at the top 1% for the top 1% of Americans is 23%, especially due to the huge decrease in corporate and estate taxes over the years and significant tax avoidance because there are so many loopholes. And I'm sure many of you read a few weeks ago that our president, Donald Trump, gets away with paying $750 in taxes on an annual basis, while the rest of us pay tens of thousands. And just think about that, right? And what that means for our society and sort of frankly, what that means for public services. The effective tax rate for this group of wealthiest Americans back in 1980 was 47%. And if we were to go back to those levels, that would bring in about $750 billion a year. And this is enough to pay for universal pre-K across the country. It's enough to pay for infrastructure upgrades for our roads and our bridges and water systems that are quite dilapidated. It's enough to pay for medical research to prevent future pandemics, right? So that we're not all sitting at home in quarantine. Clean energy, climate change, and so much more. And those are the kinds of policies that result in strong and evenly distributed economic growth. This inequality has severe consequences on our education levels, our livelihoods, our healthcare, you name it, every aspect of our society. If we go to the next slide, there we go. As economic inequality increases, the lives of the rich and poor are diverging. So a child born into the top 25% income bracket today is 45% more likely to complete college than a child who's born into the bottom 25% income bracket. And this again reinforces the generational mobility, or lack thereof that we see in our society. Next slide. This wealth also brings and buys, frankly, longer lifespans. So the gap in life expectancy between the very poorest and richest Americans is about 15 years for males and 10 years for females. And frankly, in the rest of the world, this gap has actually decreased over time, whereas in the US, it's increased for both males and females just over the past 10, 20 years, which is pretty stark. And we'll talk more about the root causes of all of these issues as well, and that what we can collectively do to reduce this stark inequality.
Thanks, Sonam. Those are some striking statistics. When I was working in the financial inclusion field, one other stat I think that really motivated my day-to-day work was, emergency savings crisis in this country. I think it's hard sometimes to conceptualize wealth and everything that goes into it, but when you hear that 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency expense, that I think really hits home and highlights the fragility of working families and how much of this country is living paycheck to paycheck. So thank you for sharing that. Aleem, can you share with us what inequality looks like in a global context?
Yeah, thanks, Alysha, and Sonam. Those are great slides. I particularly love the video on tax rate, and that's something that you can only say on this kind of webinar. But that was really striking, as you say. But I think I would layer on to that maybe before I start my comment on kind of the global disparity. I would layer on to that the American tax system, I think, is generally mainly a wage tax, right? So Social Security and Medicare contributions. Income taxes are still largely based on reported wages on that W-2 that you take home, and it's that same system that does an incredibly bad job at taxing gains to capital, right, and other sources of wealth. And it results in these kinds of anomalous situations that especially for the very poor, that may see marginal tax rates jump up at various thresholds of income, right? So $1 after kind of $18,000, you can see a marginal tax rate of something like 90% on any incremental dollar earned, right? So trying to actually tax capital, which is what the wealthy have by definition, is really hard, right? It's mobile. It comes with a lot of, you know, economic and more importantly political power. So, you know, I think that one, you know, kind of issue is certainly one that is worth, you know, paying attention to and tracking as we go through this particular election cycle. But Alysha, I'll come back to kind of the question at hand. You know, I think the audience has gotten a fair understanding of the U.S. You know, context, and maybe if we can go to the next slide. Yep, perfect. So, you know, Sonam mentioned at the beginning that kind of the disparity results from unequal distribution of income, one, wealth, two, and opportunity, you know, three, and that's kind of between different groups in society. And so what I'd like to do is, at least from on a global perspective, show those three things. So I think this first slide shows the global distribution of income as told by the Gini index. So the higher the number, the greater the inequality. Higher income individuals receiving a much larger share of the total income. So perfect equality is 0, perfect inequality is 100. And it's worth noting that, you know, over time that the Gini index has actually decreased between countries, and that's largely because of the growth of the global South. But within countries that Gini has increased over much of the last, you know, over much of the last century. So the numbers, you know, represent, you know, a few comparison points for the geographies from which the Jamaat hail here, and the U.S. shows among the more unequal distributions of income in particular. Next slide. So, you know, I think actually one slide back, sorry, Nadim. So I think the numbers that we'd like to see here, and I'm just trying to maximize the screen. So the slide 9 shows the global distribution of wealth, right? So for the same reason that I highlighted earlier, you know, the mobility of wealth, it's hard to pin this number down particularly accurately, but as against the income, you know, the wealth distribution shows a much starker picture of where the wealth is distributed across countries and within countries. And as Sonam pointed out earlier, between the US and some of the other countries from which, you know, the Jamaat comes, you can actually see a much larger disparity on income versus wealth. Can we go to the next slide on the distribution of economic opportunity? Perfect, thank you. And so the distribution of economic opportunity is often told largely by one proxy, right, which is the Human Development Index, right, and it measures things like, you know, mortality, life expectancy, educational attainment, and kind of the mean years of schooling. So this time, as against, you know, the earlier two graphs, higher numbers are better, right? So for the same countries that show roughly comparable Gini ratios on income distribution and in some cases wealth distribution, the inequality of opportunity is quite significant between the countries, right? And within the countries, the picture gets even worse, right? So it's not just income; it actually translates to vital services. You know, next slide. So this shows the disparity in some of those metrics that I highlighted, right? A child from a poor family is more than 2 times likely to die before the age of 5, right? 258 million children, so 1 out of every 5 will actually not be allowed to go to school. You know, and those that are able to go to school will have 20% less schooling than their counterparts in Western or more developed economies. You know, this has implications, right? It's not just a present statistic. It has implications for future generations and future opportunities that will be available to them, right? Within countries, you know, once you look actually within specific segments, you actually see even a more stark reality, right? Where females, racial and ethnic minorities, migrants, you know, the inequality it's staggering, right? So for every 100 primary school age girls, 100 primary school age boys, 121 girls are denied the right to education. Unpaid care work done by women is estimated at something on the order of 10.8 trillion a year. That's 6 times the size of our tech industry, right? So women have globally less income, fewer assets, and make up the largest proportion of the world's poor households, right? Women are more likely to be found in poorly paid or precarious employment, supporting markets with cheap or free labor, right? Billions of hours of unrecognized, contributions to societies and prosperity of economies. And so, I think I'll pause there. Hopefully that gives a kind of a broader sense of where the globe is in relation to the U.S. Specifically.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aleem, for providing that context. And now I think we have a great foundation for the rest of the discussion, and especially bringing in some intersectionality of, both race and gender in there, I think is an important call out. I think at this point, we're opening up a poll for the audience. Oh, there it is. Great. Audience, in your opinion, what are the major drivers of economic disparity? You can select up to 2 options, and we're going to leave the poll open for a few seconds for you to respond. And there they go. Let's see. All right, we have over half of the audience choosing the tax system. Sonam, looks like you did a great job with your presentation, emphasizing that. Just under that, we have underfunding of quality healthcare and education, 51% of the audience choosing that response. Thanks for participating, everyone. And I think our panelists have a lot to say on this question, so we'll turn it back to them. In what ways is economic disparity institutionalized? What are the root causes, and why is it so difficult to mitigate? Aleem, let's start with you.
Sure. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I invest in microfinance institutions, right? These are sometimes non-profit lenders, credit unions, non-bank finance institutions that actually provide credit, savings, insurance to individuals who traditional banks would not serve. So oftentimes these are lower income individuals. And the mere fact that I have a job and that microfinance institutions exist is a reflection of the fact that there is economic disparity and that inequality is institutionalized, right? Microfinance institutions have been created because of the inabilities of banks to actually serve lower income populations. I say inabilities, but I think oftentimes that's generous, right? And unwillingness can also be the case there, right? And today there are, at least in the U.S., 25% of the population that is unbanked or underbanked, right? And that's in our country, right? The exclusion of 1 out of 4. 1 out of 4 people doesn't count the millions of people that just actually don't even trust the financial system to actually accommodate their needs, right? So they go to pawn shops and payday lenders and whatever have you. Beyond individuals and families, there are businesses that are also excluded, globally, right? SMEs account for anywhere between 50% and by some numbers 2/3 of all new private sector jobs, but they're generally starved of financing, right? They can't get access to capital, right? That impedes entrepreneurism, that impedes job creation or innovation. The SMEs are the economic engine that's actually starved of fuel because of the lack of access to capital. So how do we build an inclusive economy when 70% of our SMEs actually lack access to basic credit, right? It's simple. If you can't access capital, you can't invest, you can't grow your business, you can't buy a home, and you can't build wealth. And really that's where the conversation needs to turn, right? It's wealth, not income, that is the means of security in America and globally. It's wealth, which is your assets, which include your investments minus your debt. Right, that's what enables you to buy homes in safe neighborhoods and better funded schools. It's wealth that allows you to send children to college without saddling them with thousands and thousands of dollars of debt. And it's what prevents a family emergency or a job loss from turning into a catastrophe, right? We heard Alysha, call out the fact that the vast majority of Americans wouldn't be able to accommodate a $400 expense, right? And that was prior to the pandemic, right? These are not major health catastrophes. These are car repairs. This is a loss of a job. This is one health event, and now we're layered in an environment in which we obviously have a pandemic on us, right? And and you know, the one thing about wealth that I think, you know, is obvious, but it bears mentioning. You know, it's not something that people, you know, create solely by themselves, right? It's accumulated across generations. There's one stat that says, you know, something on the order of 15 to 20% of American adults today can actually trace, you know, their legacy of wealth to their legacy of wealth and property ownership to a single entitlement program, which was the Homestead Act of 1860. Right, it gave away millions of acres of land to native-born and foreign, you know, white families. As part of the New Deal, 98% of the loans that the Federal Housing Administration insured, you know, until 1962 went to white Americans. And this is the program that is widely credited with building the modern middle class, right? So our inequality is deep-rooted, but it's not inevitable, right? It's a political choice. We're actually making conscious choices that lead to conscienceless capitalism, right? Our wealth is severely undertaxed. That is a conscious political choice, right? The fact that our top 1% of incomes have grown at five times the rate of our bottom 90% since 1980, that's a conscious political choice to favor executive compensation over the vast majority of wage earners and salaries. So you know, I think I'll pause there, Alysha, and maybe kind of allow, you know, Sonam to contribute there. But I just wanted to make sure that point was driven home, is that this is a conscious decision that we are taking. It's not an inevitable outflow of the economic system that we've chosen.
Thanks, Aleem. That's a really powerful point, and hopefully empowering for our audience to hear that if people have created it, people can also undo it. And I'm really glad that you mentioned access to financial services as like a key issue that stems the future asset building and wealth creation. I think our audience might be interested to know that there was the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which actually forced banks had to be forced via policy to start serving underserved areas and unbanked populations, some of which were communities of color, and others were rural white, you know, majority white communities that also were not being served. And I think there's a really interesting tool that we will drop into the chat later on. But when I was at New America, I worked on a project called Mapping Financial Opportunity. And there's an interactive map where you can actually layer on the demographics of our US population on top of where financial services are located, both banks and credit unions, but also these alternative financial services that you alluded to, Aleem, the payday lenders and the pawn shops. And you can kind of see where financial institutions are still today, you know, clustered, and where there are still banking deserts. It's kind of hard to believe that, you know, we haven't come that far in that time. But thanks for introducing that. Sonam, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, frankly, much of the root of economic disparity is actually institutionalized racism, right? And this has existed in our country long before 1776 and the movement for independence. You may have heard the phrase racial capitalism that's now being raised, particularly in the Black Lives Matter protests. And this is the kind of economy that the US has developed, which is not only just a capitalist economy, but one that was kickstarted by its reliance on slave labor, right? And I think this has continued to show up in many, many instances throughout history, the development of our country. Since this is a webinar about voting and the importance of voting, I think one statistic that often comes out, and you might be hearing about this on the news, that we're hearing significant cases of voter suppression across the country, but especially in the South, which has a history of stopping African Americans and minorities from exercising their right to vote, whether it's Jim Crow laws or otherwise. About 5 million Americans cannot vote in federal elections because they're felons. And many of them cannot afford bail, right? For a lot of the reasons that we talked about earlier in terms of the huge gap in wealth and income amongst African Americans versus other folks in our society. Of these 5 million, only 25% of them are actually still in jail, and the rest have completed their time and are home free. But in some states in the South, 1 in 7 Black Americans is disenfranchised. So you and I take the right to vote for granted. Many people cannot, right? Another place where this shows up is Harris County, right, the broader Houston metro area where many folks in our Jamaat live, there's one drop box to drop off your ballot for a county of 4.7 million people, right? And there's a court case going on right now to reverse this, right? And it's sort of gone back and forth, and we'll see where it lands. But we see this, frankly, across the country. During the pandemic in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, there were 5 polling stations for the metro area, which is predominantly African-American, whereas there were 100 stations in the white suburbs, right? And this was sort of at the beginning in March and April when people were scared, right? They didn't know what was happening. And you had huge, huge lines of people trying to get their vote in while it's hailing on them, right? And that just shows how unequal our voting system is for some of our minority communities. Frankly, this shows up in housing policy, right? So housing affordability is often characterized as an individual or a family paying less than 30% of their income for their total housing costs. In places like New York or San Francisco, very high cost cities, often 50% of residents are rent burdened, meaning that they pay much more than 30% of their income for housing. And this is especially true amongst Hispanics and African Americans whose incomes are low, right? Often working in retail or food service or other low wage jobs. So their income isn't even high enough to then pay 30, 40, 57, in some cases 70% of their income for housing costs in cities where they need to live to have access to jobs. And this goes even further to folks who may have enough resources to purchase their own homes, but there's still a significant amount of discrimination. Some studies show that 60 to 70% of minorities face housing discrimination when it comes to getting a mortgage. They may be paying a higher interest rate than you and I might be, even though we have the same income levels and other demographic information. And in some extreme cases, real estate brokers don't even show homes in certain majority white neighborhoods. And these practices have continued since the 70s, and frankly, they're illegal, right? But nobody's really stopping them and nobody's really monitoring them. So you have Black communities that are being pushed up further and further from job centers. And, I studied urban planning, right? So my mind sort of thinks in like 10,000-foot maps, right? And how people move and get access to services. And when it comes to transportation, right, the gold standard is to live within 30 to 45 minutes of your work. In most African-American communities, that goes up to about 1 or 1.5 hours. What does that mean in real life, right? It means less time with your children. It means less time to read to them before they go to sleep and to develop those early childhood skills that will then help with their education and sort of help them rise up, right? So just those contexts, right, is very, very stark, and we see it every day in our communities, and it's up to us to actually do something about it.
Thank you, Sonam. Yeah, that's a really motivating note to end on. That was great historical context and even some present day anecdotes, but I think top of mind, we talk about present day current events is COVID-19. So we'd love to hear your thoughts briefly on how COVID-19 has either exacerbated existing or created some new disparities. Somebody wants to take this one.
Yeah, I think one stat, again, a presentation full of stats, right? But 45 million Americans lost their jobs, right? I very starkly remember the New York Times graphic where there was this huge long line, right, of job decreases back in March and April. And during the same time, the top, 1% of Americans made about $580 billion through the capital markets in just a span of 3 months, right? And here's a reminder to everyone that the stock market is not the real economy. And the wealth and safety of America's small businesses is not measured in the S&P or Dow Jones. And we sometimes forget about that. The pandemic has widened already worrisome levels of income, racial, and gender inequality in the US. Communities of color, as we've talked about, right, are overrepresented in the essential workforce in our country as bus drivers or grocery store clerks or delivery staff, many of whom are much more exposed to the virus than someone like me who's sitting on Zoom calls all day, right, in front of a computer. And race has played a huge role in this. And we've seen that, again, through the Black Lives Matters protests and beyond, where Blacks and Latinos have been hospitalized due to COVID 5 times as much as white Americans, right? In 2020, more Black Americans will die of COVID than will succumb to diabetes, strokes, accidents, pneumonia, and a whole host of other diseases. And fundamentally, it comes back to people's income in their everyday lives, right? And that includes their ability to access healthcare services and proactively address comorbidities such as diabetes or high blood pressure or other ailments. And if you're living, 45 minutes, an hour away from your nearest healthcare provider, like what are the chances that you're actually going to go and make that doctor's appointment, right? Or if you're living paycheck to paycheck, are you actually going to take time off, whether it's 1 hour or 1 day, to actually go see the doctor? And we're living in this precarious situation before the pandemic, and it's gotten much worse, right? Alysha mentioned the stat that about 40% of Americans can't withstand a $400 emergency, let alone 6 months of unemployment, right? And a $1,200 stimulus check is only going to go so far to soften that blow. And when all of this hit, right, there again, I come back to sort of the government infrastructure to address the social safety net. And we've had incredibly outdated unemployment systems that couldn't get money out fast enough, right? So you see 2 to 3 month delays for unemployment benefits while we're in full lockdown and people are just scared, right? Like, am I going to be able to put food on the table for my family? And on the bright side, it's actually kind of amazing to see some new technologies come into play. Platforms like Give Directly, which distribute funds that they collect through donations. They distribute funds to folks who are undocumented or otherwise ineligible for federal aid. Or Propel, which is an app that helps people access food stamps and other social safety benefits. And more broadly, the concept of universal basic income is now getting the airtime that it deserves in policy and business circles. So we really saw a plethora of innovation to help unbanked and underbanked individuals, and I hope to see these, many of these changes last.
Thanks, Sonam. Aleem, anything to add? Yeah,
maybe I'll offer kind of the global perspective maybe once again, right? Yesterday, so kind of October 17th was the International Day for Eradication of Poverty. I know all of you had that marked on your calendars. But it's been 27 years. So it was established in kind of the early 90s by the UN General Assembly. And for the last over 20 years, we've been demonstrating year-on-year gains in our ability to address extreme poverty across the globe. And this year, yesterday was the first time in over 20 years that we were not able to do that, right? That we were not able to demonstrate progress. It was the first time that we were likely to see global extreme poverty rise as a result of COVID-19, but probably as a result of multiple compounding forces, right? So we're certainly seeing the pandemic, we're seeing emergence of conflict globally, and we're seeing climate change, right? So prior to this year, we had 750 million people living in extreme poverty, right? Half of humanity was living on less than $5.50 a day. The pandemic is likely to bring in, estimates vary, but anywhere between 88 and 115 million additional people into poverty. Climate change is likely to contribute over the next 10 years to an additional 130 million people, right? By 2030, we're likely to have 66% of the global poor in conflict or conflict affected areas, right? And so because of some of these compounding forces, we're erasing almost a generation of gains that we've made. But oftentimes, like you hear Sonam and me speak, and kind of Alysha's kind of stats, and it's depressing, right? But I think in order to do the work that we do, I think we are inherently optimistic, right? And I think that the optimism here comes from the fact that the pandemic, at least in the U.S. and to a certain extent globally, was able to shine a light on the nation's low-wage service workers, right? The delivery drivers, the grocery clerks, and then on top of that, I think it created, I hope it created some shared destiny or common understanding between between kind of the haves and have-nots, right? The concept that I can't be healthy if you aren't, and you know, I think when the problems are this apparent and in your face, you can finally do something about it, right? So I'm hopeful that we are at the precipice of a transformative moment, right? But we just need to get serious about, you know, creating a more just society. But the problems are in front of us, and now I think we can actually get to the solutions.
Thanks, Aleem. And I think we'll come back to some more solutions in a second. But first, we have another poll question for the audience. So audience, which of the solutions listed do you believe can most adequately address economic inequality in the US? We'll give you a few seconds to respond again. And here are the results. Let's see, we have 37% saying higher taxes on corporations and the ultra rich. It's definitely in the lead. And the second most popular answer is affordable, high quality healthcare options for all. Wonderful. And then for our very last poll question, we can launch that. We would like to know from the audience, who do you think is responsible for reducing inequality? Is it government, either federal or state and local government? Is it large businesses and corporations, wealthy individuals, religious organizations? If you could take a second and vote, we would appreciate it. And the results are showing a whopping 60% have chosen the federal government. Let's see, about a quarter of you selected large businesses and corporations. Notably, 0% have chosen wealthy individuals or religious organizations. So that's interesting. Let's turn it back to our panelists. Aleem, starting with you, related to those poll questions. In what ways can we move towards building a stronger and more inclusive economy? And what examples have inspired you in your work?
Well, given the audience, I think I can just throw my response away on this one. But yeah, let me try to convince more than just 25% of you on kind of my thought process here, right? So I think we've established that, you know, not doing anything is not an option, right? There's a common misconception that doing nothing is free or cheap. That's not an option, right? And so you know, how do we address it, right? We have the old playbook, right, which is, you know, philanthropy, that, you know, individual actors accumulate, you know, wealth and they give back through philanthropy as a way of addressing the inequality. You know, given that most people actually didn't respond to you know, kind of the wealthy individuals, I suppose, you know, maybe that's kind of a reflection of the fact that philanthropy, you know, may or may not be able to address the root causes, rather than just, you know, the symptoms of what we're seeing, right? And so, you know, oftentimes, you know, I think it was Dr. King that said that, you know, philanthropy may not be able to address the circumstances of the economic injustice, which makes philanthropy necessary, right? And so, you know, what's the alternative? And you know, I can tell you from my own experience, right, that I would want us to challenge, or I would want us to challenge kind of the original notion of what business and what the private sector can do here, right? I would want us to think about that. You know, the problems that we're facing are immense, right? They're intersectional, and governments alone governments, even alongside civil society, may not be able to address these problems, by themselves, right? So, I think, again, I'll go, business school on this topic again, but, 50 years ago, it was September 1970. So, 50 years ago, last month, an economist by the name of Milton Friedman published an essay in the New York Times Magazine, right? And it was arguably the most consequential economic idea of the 20th century. And it suggested that the social responsibility of business is just to increase its profits, period, full stop. Right? And so a generation of CEOs have gone through these business schools and are winding up in boardrooms around the US and suggesting that the sole responsibility to society of business is to make money, right? Not the health of our communities, not the well-being of our workers, not, nothing related to our climate or our environment. None of that is our problem as business. And I think from my perspective and from where I sit, my day job, I see that changing, right? I see entrepreneurs, building more inclusive companies that are looking at their communities, that are looking at their workers, that are looking at their suppliers and even their competitors as all stakeholders. And instead of focusing on short-term value, they're actually looking at the long-term value for all stakeholders. So not short-term value for shareholders, long-term value for stakeholders, right? And these are the businesses that are subjecting themselves to higher standards of social performance, public transparency, accountability to balance profit and purpose, right? And companies who are well known to, I think, a lot of them, right? Patagonia, Stonyfield Farms, Natural Cosmetics, right? A lot of these people have prioritized that it is in their best interest to actually serve society more broadly and not simply their base of shareholders. And I think that the second thing maybe I would suggest here is that I think it's worth taking a look at how we provide capital, right? How we undertake risk taking for social change, right? Reflect our values in the way we spend and invest our money. As consumers, we obviously take decisions every day, right? We support some companies and some causes and not others. As investors, every dollar we invest is impactful, right? Whether it's a positive impact or a negative impact, that's the question that we need to answer, right? And understanding that consuming and investing is in a way that reflects our values and principles of our faith is the basis of impact investing, right? That's what I do. That's the field I'm in. And so, impact investing, simply put, is just investments that are made with the intention to generate measurable social and environmental return alongside financial return. And it's now becoming mainstream. Many people don't realize it, but impact investing actually gained momentum 40 years ago as a tool to fight apartheid in South Africa. So why wouldn't it be a tool to fight racial apartheid in the US, right? Leaders that came to the fore at that point in time were from faith-based and faith-inspired investors that focused on the shared responsibility to address the ills at that time, right? Community development investing in the US was actually similarly born out of the civil rights movement. So impact investing itself is actually undergoing a change, right? It's moving from simply business's responsibility to society to actually business's responsibility to building resilience and actually regenerating societies, building back all the support mechanisms that we've shattered over the course of the last few decades as we focused primarily on shareholder value. So I'll pause there, but I think that's really my broad thought process and my posit to our audience here that I think we need to look at beyond the federal government and beyond actually looking at simply actors in the way that they've frame their role in society.
Thanks, Aleem. Powerfully said. I'm thinking back to my undergrad days when pushing for a socially responsible invested endowment was such a big issue and continues to be on many undergrad campuses and grad campuses as well. Sonam, I'll turn it over to you for your perspective.
Yeah, as you can probably tell by now, I'm passionate about government and the role it plays in creating an equitable and just society. And I think, a reduction in income inequality is one of the most important, if not the single most important structural changes that needs to be implemented so that the US economy can return to a sustainable growth pattern, right? And a lot of it is through, consumer behavior and quite a bit of, where your money is going, right, collectively, that Aleem talked about. And to me, sort of government creates that infrastructure, right, for the private sector to build on. It sets the rules of the game, whether it's minimum wage that's high enough for a person to afford a roof over their head and feed a family, or it's paid sick leave so that you can take time off of work to take care of yourself without worrying about the paycheck, right? Or it's addressing huge challenges like climate change that are playing out in front of us and frankly are going to get much worse if we don't do something about it. So for me, like having worked at the intersection of the public and private sectors, I think it's up to both to create the society that we want to live in and in partnership with each other. And some concrete examples, right? One of my favorite initiatives that I launched in New York City was a program called We NYC, or Women Entrepreneurs New York City, right? And it helps women start and scale their businesses. In New York, there are almost 500,000 women entrepreneurs, but only 3% of venture capital funding goes to all women teams. And commercial loans are about 30% less than those for men, right? From traditional financial institutions like Bank of America or JP Morgan or wherever you get your small business loans. And this is clearly a market failure, right? So we as government intervened because that's the role that we play, right? So we designed a huge new initiative to provide women access to free legal resources, to mentorship, to low-cost loans, to crowdfunding opportunities through a platform called Kiva, and partnered with women-focused venture funds to create a $30 million initiative to jumpstart these businesses. And we launched this initiative several years ago, and New York City now is ranked the #1 place in the world for women entrepreneurs to succeed. That's 3 years running, right? And we've since expanded We NYC to We Chicago and We Boston and several other cities. I think another big area of focus should be workforce development. And again, here's another place where government and the private sector can join forces, right? So again, in New York City, we launched something called Tech Talent Pipeline about 4.5, 5 years ago. And it creates industry partnerships with 150 tech employers in New York City, right? So this includes everybody from sort of your Google and Facebook and Amazon, all the way to smaller startups that are looking for tech talent. And they help inform the curriculum that's taught to folks without a college degree who are learning how to code. And because these are skills that are relevant to the employer's hiring needs, these folks get jobs coming straight out of this program, right? And it's completely free. And it doesn't mean that you need to be like a tech savvy 20-something to do all of this. And we've placed thousands of people across age ranges because at the end of the day, talent is talent, right? No matter what age you are. So I'd encourage those of us who are in positions of power to share that power. Hire people from non-traditional backgrounds. I guarantee that they will be some of the best employees because they have a thirst to do better. It means putting your money where your mouth is, right? So instead of buying something on Amazon, and frankly, I'm guilty myself, right? But instead of buying something on Amazon, walk down the street and buy it from your local bodega or your woman or Black-owned business. And there are plenty of resources online to help you locate where these businesses exist, right? And these are your everyday consumer choices. But to a small business owner, and frankly, many of our Jamaati members are small business owners, so I think this resonates a lot within our community, your dollar means a lot. So those are sort of concrete examples and what we can do.
Thank you, Sonam, for those concrete examples. I know we have a ton of questions coming in, so I think maybe we will just squeeze in one more question and then turn it over to the audience. So clearly you've both dedicated your careers to the social impact, public interest field. Curious, in what ways do you believe your faith has guided you to think about and become involved in those fields? Sonam, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to Aleem and many of the stories in our Jamaat, right? For me, I was also undocumented, right? I came to this country when I was about a year and a half, and I didn't get my legal status until I was halfway through college, right? So about 20 years of my life. And as a young child, I was oblivious, right? I didn't know what a green card meant, and I didn't know what citizenship meant. And, in hindsight, so many of the services that I gained as a child were through Jamaat Khana, right? I would go to the dental clinics and the doctors' clinics for the free screenings and eye exams and whatever else that were done in our social hall. Tutoring programs and a whole host of other activities that were provided to our community for free, right? Because again, our Ismaili community is part and parcel of that civil society infrastructure that exists to complement the services that government and private sector should be providing to society. So within that, right, so much of what I sort of was shaped with was within that community. And for me, it's all about paying it forward, right? So it's about taking some of the benefit. I am the beneficiary of our community, right? And now I, again, as I said, am in a position of power, right? So what can I do with my power to help those who are coming up behind me?
Absolutely. Aleem, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Sonam really kind of hit it on the head, right? The work that we do is really an expression of our faith, right? I grew up in that same kind of voluntary, kind of the ethic of service, right? My grandparents on food committee and Jamati Safai committee, right? They weren't attaching any SDG tiles to the work that they were doing, but they were doing impactful work for our community. Right. And that's true of the original impact investors in our community, right? We were an undocumented family with no experience in the restaurant business. And we got our first loan from a Jamati member to be able to open a restaurant in New York City, right? The guarantors who co-signed for a mortgage on our home, they were Jamati members, right? And they did it for the improvement of the community broadly. And I can't agree with Sonam more. I think our privilege and our position of power now is something that we need to use in order to actually be able to assist that next generation, right? Assist kind of the next category of individuals who are disenfranchised. I think we have a tremendous amount of resources, and maybe one question that we all collectively will also need to ask ourselves is, we are to a large extent now beneficiaries of a system that has promoted inequality for a large segment of the population. And so if we are trying to reform a system that has benefited us, what are we willing to give up? Sonam and I are both Harvard grads. There's a long legacy of a legacy history in our academic institutions. Are we willing to give that up for our children to be able to bring broader equality in educational outcomes and attainment, right? Those are things that we need to be grappling with, and difficult questions that we need to be answering for ourselves.
Absolutely, I can definitely relate. And Sonam, I'm glad you mentioned the phrase civil society. I think it's something that we hear so often that Maulana Hazarumam emphasizes, and it's great to see two examples of what that actually looks like to build civil society through your professional careers. So I think now would be a great time to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. I know we've covered so much ground already, from baseline stats on what economic inequality looks like at home and abroad, to some root causes and present day policies that allow it to persist. I think one question that might be particularly interesting for the audience is some advice from you all. The question is, how might we stay engaged with change-making work after the November elections? And I'll add on to that, while voting is important, what else can we do to sustain our civic engagement beyond the elections?
So I'll start with the emphasis on voting, right? And try to hit that home for everyone who's trying to figure out how to fill out the ballot and where your signature goes and whatnot. But our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The tenets of our Constitution is underpinned by your right to vote. Right. And again, take it from two people whose families and frankly, still, many folks in our Jamaat cannot vote. Right. So you're doing this for us, right? For people like us and for people from our community and your neighbors and your friends and family. Right. So cannot emphasize that enough. Go out, vote, figure it out. iwillvote.com. will give you exactly what you need to do to get registered, to get your ballot, to find your polling station, and it's super, super easy. That said, right, America this is a national election, and of course, who is president is incredibly important to our lives, but I want to emphasize also that America has about 19,000 cities, towns, villages, with different government structures, right? And local elections are where you elect your sheriffs, your school boards, your district attorneys, your city council members, right? State assembly members, mayors, governors. And these people influence almost every aspect of your life, right? Whether it's police accountability, the quality of your kids' schools, public health preparedness, right? And testing facilities and vaccination drives and whatnot, affordable housing, job training programs, access to public transit, investments in parks and libraries, and the list goes on. Even still, voter turnout in local elections is about 15% of the registered electorate, right? Which is very, very low. And again, it impacts your day-to-day. So all I would say is, don't just go to the polls on November 3rd, but become active in your community, right? Like vote in your local elections, take up a cause, however small it is, and make it your priority. It may be that you care a lot about the types of lunches that are served in your kids' schools, right? And the nutritional content of those lunches. Get together with a couple parents, right? And advocate for that change. And me being someone who has worked in government, right? I worked for the mayor of New York City, which is it is the largest city, right? The largest government infrastructure in the United States. I see firsthand what community action and citizen engagement looks like when people like me are actually making the decisions. And I cannot emphasize enough that your voice actually does matter. So, pick up the phone and get to it.
Yeah, and may I just add, Alysha, if that's okay, I know we're running short on time, but I think we certainly, we need to exercise our constitutional right to vote, and I think people would be forgiven for losing track of what presidential elections and our government actually mean for people outside of our borders, right? And kind of the people I interact with on a daily basis are looking at it, right? They're looking at it for the strength of all of these Western institutions like NATO, like the WHO, like our contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement, right? There are going to be, we reviewed the devastating impacts of climate change and conflict and the pandemic, right? And on November 4th, 2020, that's the day that we are officially going to be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, right? In July 2021, that's the date of our proposed withdrawal from the WHO, right? Those are going to be, significant events, and already, conversations are starting around transparency and reform and accountability without the U.S. at the table. And so, really, from our perspective, when we vote, we want to vote for what's likely, what reflects our view of the world, what reflects the situation that we would want our kids and grandkids to grow up in. And maybe I'll offer just one other thing, is that it's not enough to be against the bad policies. I think you have to be for the good policies, right? And use your voice, not only in voting, but I mean, today's conversation was fairly far reaching. We talked about engagement with the community through civil society organizations. We talked about engagement with the private sector. The number of times in boardroom discussions that somebody's held up a piece of paper saying, this is a complaint that I got from a customer of ours, that actually has made it to policy changes at a boardroom level and at a management team level is astounding, right? So don't be afraid, right? Don't be afraid to actually write those letters and actually advocate for the kind of world that you want to see.
Absolutely. And related to that, can you just touch on briefly, for folks who are planning to vote, how can voters evaluate candidates for how effectively their policies actually impact social inequality? So when we go to vote, how are we making our voting decisions?
Sonam, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, sure. There are tons of resources. Google is your best friend. But Ballotpedia is a resource. Go to the campaign's websites, right? JoeBiden.com, DonaldTrump.com, DonaldJTrump.com. whatever his website is, right? And actually read what these things say. Follow the news, right? So websites like Vox and some of those other investigative journalism sites do deep dives into campaign policy to assess like how realistic is this climate change plan, right? And the numbers behind all of that. This is super nerdy, but actually like take a look at your city and federal government's budget, right? The fact that the US, we talked a lot about tax policy, that's just enough money coming in, right? Like how is that money actually being spent? And educate yourself, right? The US spends about $750 billion a year on defense spending, right? Do we actually need to do that, right? Or should that be going to schools and healthcare? So there are lots and lots of different things. And I think, we're gonna send a follow-up to folks who registered with a couple of resources. So we'll certainly add those in.
And I would just layer on one other point, which is just diversify your information sources. There is just so much disinformation out there that even your traditional sources, if it's social media or whatever have you, I think please diversify your availability of information and where you're accessing your information, and be critically kind of thinking through the questions for yourself and the impact not only on your family but society at large.
That is great advice. And I'll also add in that a lot of state ballots this year have questions on the back. So don't forget to flip over. And it's not just about the candidates that you're voting for, but also some policy questions important to research. I know we only have a few minutes left. And instead of making the hard decision of picking the last question, I'm going to put two out there and you can all pick between them. One of them is, what is the role of philanthropy, both institutional philanthropy and also individual charitable giving, in mitigating economic disparity? And another question that has come in is, what advice do you have for young people who want to be involved in socially impactful work?
Maybe I'll start with the second question on young people, right? Both of us were young at one point in our lives, right? And some making some of these career choices and thinking through. And, frankly, you can get started as early as you want, right? Greta Thunberg, who's one of the leading voices for climate change, I think is like 16, right? Or something of that sort, right? So again, it sort of goes back to my earlier point, right? Like you as a young person might not care about your school lunches as much as your parents care about, what's the pizza and snacks that are served to you, but you might care about the air quality in your neighborhood, right? Or you might care about access to local parks. And I guarantee every city, right, every village, town council, whatnot, has open meetings, right? Show up to one of them. They happen at 4 or 5 p.m. after school. Just get involved, learn about what's going on in your neighborhood. And it's super easy, low time commitment, just to educate yourself. I think another thing, and frankly, I cannot emphasize enough the power of networking, and you can get started as early as you want with that, right? So if you're reading a news article and you find someone's interesting has been quoted, like look up their email, send them a note, right? Know that 9 times out of 10, that person actually will respond because they care about you as a young person and they care about sort of influencing the next generation. But even if they don't, right, go on to the next person. But I cannot emphasize like how important it is to actually educate yourself. And the way to do that is not only just through reading, but actually actively participating, right? So actively joining these conversations, whether they're one-on-one or through your community, to learn more about the issues, like take a stance on those issues and then do something about those issues. And I will repeat again, right? Please feel free to get in touch with either of us or any of us if we can help in any way.
Yeah, no, really well said, Sonam, and I would echo everything that you've just kind of put out there. I think you'll find a strong and steady base of mentors. You don't have to look very much further than the community. Certainly, you can find mentors from anywhere, and I think for those of us who are involved in social impact, we are trying to pay it forward, and we are actually trying to increase our numbers. Right, there are going to be people who are very willing and willing to and accommodative to questions and just explorations. So feel free to reach out. I think that's probably your best way, and find those mentors that actually can coach you through, your upcoming life decisions, whether it's career related or school related.
Thank you both. And I think one other point I would add to the advice question is for young people to develop expertise in a domain. I think that that's always useful in a lot of these social justice organizations, and you're never too young to use your lived experience, as well as, even early things like internships. I know I got my start with a National Hunger Fellowship, that really influenced the future choices that I made. I'm getting the sign that we need to wrap up. So with respect for that, I just want to start by thanking our panelists, Aleem and Sonam. Thank you very much for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And thank you to the Critical Conversations team that's behind the scenes here. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of a critical conversation. A couple of announcements before you go. You can check your registration status, get registered to vote, and more at b.smiley/USA/vote. There is also a national hotline that you can call or text, pretty tech savvy. You can text or call 202-854-VOTE, V-O-T-E. Election day is November 3rd, but early voting is already started in many states, so we encourage you to look out and pursue that. We are also posting some resources recommended by our panelists in the chat box, and we'll send them out via email to everyone who has registered. Look out for more info on this week's Young Adult Conversations and our next critical conversation on the.smiley/USA webpage and on social media. And lastly, please take the survey that will pop up on your screen as you leave the session. We'd appreciate any and all feedback you may have. Thank you again, Ya Ali Madad, and don't forget to vote.